Welcome to the first session of the Flight of Ariel, Universalism in Latin American Thought by Daniel Sacilotto. In his groundbreaking study, Ariel y Arisbe, evolución y evaluación del concepto de Latinoamérica en el siglo XX, Colombian philosopher Fernando Zalamea proposes a broad genealogy of what he named the 20th century Latin American universalist tradition. Guided by the utopian aspiration to nurture productive mediations between distinct modes of expression and seek new modes of integration between different cultural forms, this trajectory of thought emphasizes the place of Latin America as a space of cultural synthesis, within which the particularities of its local traditions and unique histories were to become integrated into a local horizon of intellectual production and emancipation across the sciences, arts, and politics. In this seminar, we will examine how a universalist tradition conceived of complementarity between the local and global in the attempt to think of the identity and destiny of Latin American nations and of the continent as a whole. Our instructor, Daniel Sacilotto, is a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California, Los Angeles. His research focuses on the fields of contemporary philosophy and Latin American literature. In particular, his research focuses on the reconciliation of rationalism and materialism and the methodological relation between epistemology and ontology in contemporary philosophy. He's currently finishing a full-length monograph tentatively titled Saving the Noumenon, an essay on the foundations of ontology in which he proposes a critical reading of the ontological turn in contemporary philosophy, and lays the foundations for a new transcendental epistemology, chiefly inspired by the works of Wilfrid Sellars, Robert Brandom, Alain Badiou, Lawrence Punto, Ray Brassier, Reza Negarentasne, and Ray Rosenberg. Please, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paula. Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Incidentally, that bio is a little outdated, I think. I think that's several years old at this point, so things have gone along since then. But in any case, it's good to see you all. Some familiar faces, of course, some new ones here. Those who don't have your cameras activated, it would be nice to be able to see you if possible. I know that at least Raviv is working in a library right now, so cannot join all the time, at least then with a camera. But in any case, so welcome to the seminar. This will be a very cramped 4 weeks, I think, intensive, I think, as well. Today, as usual, I will be sort of engaging in a kind of introductory seminar of sorts where I will be giving the sort of historical background, but there's already a tract or one of the traditions that we will be talking about will be the subject matter for conversation today, which is the first constellation of universalist thought in Latin America that will occupy us, which is the tradition of what we call Arielismo. But we will get to that in due course. What I like to do at the beginning of every seminar usually is just to briefly introduce ourselves, say who we are, what our background is. In this case, I want to know, if possible, what background you have in philosophy and Latin American studies, if any at all, and what your interest is in the seminar. That way I can perhaps emphasize certain points and moments in the seminar and certain topics as well. So I'm going to go here in order.
Just 1 second, Daniel, because we're recording and in the first session, we prefer not having the presentations. Maybe we can do it at the last, like at the last moments or the next one. That is good.
You mean at the end of today's session?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I mean, it's weird. I've always done it at the beginning, but okay. So,
at the end of this one is okay.
Okay, great. So that means I don't know very much about any of you, but I know at least some of you. So hopefully, at the very least, can I get a show of hands for how many people here have a background in Latin American studies or Latin Americanism? Isabel and maybe Somebody else? Anybody else? No? Okay, great. So it seems like we are entering into new waters mostly right here, and that's actually good. Because this is also part of an ongoing project that I have undertaken that is transformed into a book project, which is titled after this seminar, although slightly different. But I will be talking a little bit at the beginning about the general scope of this project and the historical basis for the project before starting to talk more concretely about the development of the ideas that compose the project. And with that in mind, I will try to probably I don't know if time will allow, but we'll begin for sure talking about the first constellation of thought that begins this tradition that I name Latin American Universalism, again, following the work of Zalamea. But also, as you will see, what I will try to do today also right now is to situate the project that I'm developing in the context of other genealogies and periodizations, not only of Latin American philosophy, understood in the narrow sense, as a disciplinary, let's say, endeavor, but more broadly also to understand how it is that universalism belongs to a constellation of thought, more broadly stated, where by thought we include not only philosophy, but also connections, relatively vital connections in this case, to artistic movements and to other forms of cultural production beyond philosophy in the strict sense. In fact, one of the themes that will occupy us is, as we move along, a question that in fact was formulated within the Latin American tradition, that is, what is or what are the conditions for a Latin American philosophy, if such a thing can exist at all, or if it has existed at all? So this question is not just about the nature of philosophy in particular, but what it would mean for Latin America to be able to produce a philosophy that could be called Latin American, if at all. Now, before we get to that crux of the road, I will be mentioning a few of the, let's say, methodological frameworks that animate my own reconstruction of this genealogy that I will be presenting, and of the different moments and traditions that I will be speaking of in the weeks to come. So what I will do now is simply to begin, as usual, I use PowerPoint for these purposes, and I will be going sort of methodologically and slowly, stopping periodically to ask the class for any questions or clarificatory remarks. But without further ado, allow me to get started. So everyone can see the PowerPoint right now? Yep, great. So the flight of Ariel. The title, as some of you might know, of course, makes reference to the figure of Ariel, which is a Shakespearean character, but which features prominently in a conceptual typology elaborated by the Uruguayan thinker José Enrique Rodó, who we will be speaking of hopefully today, if not definitely next time. Allow me to begin by citing these two passages. I include the original in Spanish and the translation in English. These are mine, by the way, translations. I will be also including a bunch of passages from texts that are not translated. And incidentally, just before we start, I should mention that you should check always periodically. I'm constantly updating the online materials available in the class folder. And what I'm doing also is engaging in a sort of, let's say, rogue translation using online tools, but also looking over them of some texts that have not been translated into English, so that you can find some important texts from the traditions that we will be speaking of in provisional translations that have been, electronically generated, but that I've edited as well. And they're surprisingly good. Google Translate has gotten pretty good, actually. So take a look at that. The first quote here is by Simón Bolívar, the great liberator, El Liberador, from a short text which was titled Proclama, was from 1824, 29th of July. It is compiled in his complete works, and it says the following. La libertad del nuevo mundo es la esperanza del universo. Or in English, the liberty of the new world is the hope of the universe. Or for the universe, perhaps, would be even better. Now, this oracular, prophetic quote, I think, encapsulates really in a kind of, again, aphoristic manner, the idea that is going to animate what I will name Latin American universalisms in concrete. And I will get to that idea soon enough. The second quote is by, of course, Rubén Darío, the greatest exemplar of modernista poetics. Si en estos cantos hay política, es porque aparece universal. Y si encontraráis versos a un presidente, es porque son un clamor continental. Mañana podremos ser yanquis, y es lo más probable. De todas maneras, mi protesta queda escrita sobre las alas de los inmaculados cisnes, tan ilustres como Júpiter. In English, if there is politics in these songs, it is because it is universal. And if you find verses to a precedent, it is because they are a continental clamor. Tomorrow we could be Yankees, and it's most likely. In any case, my protest is written on the wings of the immaculate swans, as illustrious as Jupiter. This is from his third and most, I think, progressive poetic collection, Cantos de Vida y Esperanza, Songs of Life and Hope, 1905. So the seminar is actually based on, as I mentioned, a book project, which is a study of what I named the Latin American Universalist tradition. Now, this term, Latin American Universalism, or the Latin American Universalist tradition, is a term that has been used by the philosopher Fernando Zalamea. I've made reference to this work several times, and it will be one of the works we read in the fourth and final week, at least partially. And the idea here is that we will be examining a constellation of thought that actually has different constitutive phases. I've identified a series of phases for this particular seminar, even though we're going to be talking about them in a very protracted manner and condensed manner. But today I will try to also flesh out a little bit more clearly what the genealogy that I've reconstructed is. In a certain way, this project emerges as an extension of my first book project, which was also my dissertation project way back when, which was an exploration on the indigenista revolutionary tradition in the Andes and in Peru in particular. This ended up becoming a book, as I mentioned, titled Universality and Utopia. And it was an examination of the works of Mariátegui, of César Vallejo, and of José María Arguedas, who are three of the most important writers in what is today called indigenismo, a literature about the rural Indian written from an urban setting, but preoccupied with not only a description of the Indian as, let's say, an object of study for mestizo imaginaries, but furthermore, to think of the conditions for the emancipation of the Indian and the incorporation of the rural Indian into, let's say, the tasks of statecraft, into the prospects for nation building. Fernando Zalamea, in this book titled Ariel y Arisbe, Evolución y Evaluación del Concepto de América Latina en el Siglo XX, Evolution and Evaluation of the Concept of Latin America in the 20th Century, proposes this genealogy of what he calls Latin American Universalism. And in order to do this, he proposes that perhaps what is most distinctive about the intellectual tradition of Latin American writers, including here not only philosophers, but also literature, is that it conceived of itself as a space of synthesis. This is Zalamea's own expression. And by space of synthesis, what he means is essentially a space where different identity markers, let's say, different forms of empirical determination, cultural, religious, ethnic, finally, sexual and gender, etc., every possible form of, let's say, empirical determination was open to a kind of, let's say, space of hybridity. Mestizaje was conceived as not only, let's say, the outcome of colonialism for Latin America, the outcome of the ethnic bringing of the European blood with indigenous blood, but it was conceived also as a historical potential and a cultural potential. And Zalamea argues this potential for hybridity actually defines the way in which different, let's say, utopian imaginaries were forged in Latin America. Since already the colonial period, but more precisely and more specifically in the 20th century. Why in the 20th century does this begin? Well, Zalamea does not really engage with much of a historical exegetical reconstruction of this. He simply lists a series of authors moving somewhat chronologically from the 20th century, beginning with Andrés Bello and Rodó, and moving forward all the way into the end of the 20th century. But what I will try to do is to actually, let's say, refine this genealogical exercise to try to trace back not only different names ordered sequentially, but moreover, to try to isolate different configurations of thought, schools of thought, and let's say orientations of thought that make up this larger tradition that we might call Latin American universalism on the one hand, but on the other hand, which also neatly separates different, let's say, constellations in which different philosophical sources and ideas, political aspirations were formulated. And the core thesis that I will formulate, let's say, building from Zalamea, but also from an expression that was coined and developed by, at the very least popularized by Angel Rama, is that Latin America and Latin American universalism in particular is a tradition that was very much concerned with the conditions of thinking the conditions for what I will call unlimited transcultural synthesis. Unlimited transcultural synthesis. Transculturation, which is, once more, this idea of a kind of, let's say, synthetic hybridity of cultures, of different cultural expressions and all forms of identity, at the limit becomes conceived as the kind of foundation for a new kind of culture, a new kind of cultural pact or dynamic that will be precisely what informs this universalist horizon for Latin American thinkers. Here's a quote from Zalamea's book from the very beginning, from the introduction, where this conception of Latin America as a space of synthesis becomes defined slightly more precisely. Latin America, and by the way, I wish I could have the time to always have the Spanish next to the English. This is an example where, for example, the book by Zalamea is not translated into English. So, but of course, we don't, so I will just go with the English. Latin America can be seen as a place of links, as a relational place on a cultural continuum from which it cannot and should not be isolated, and as a place in which clear strengths of hybridization and synthesis have developed largely thanks to its very borderline condition on the spectrum of culture. That Latin America can generally be seen as a relational place within a continuum, and that its specificity lies in its general capacity to build hybridizations and counterpoints on this relational fabric, and in a constant to and fro from the limits between universality and resistance. Now, this quote is very loaded. It is given in the introduction to the book, but many of these terms, and we will get a chance to actually look at Zalamea's project more closely, will become then fleshed out as part of a particular philosophical program that, in the case of Zalamea, is built and develops from a kind of formal ontology that he draws mostly from the work of Charles Saunders Peirce, one of the, of course, classical pragmatists and developers of what today now sometimes is called diagrammatic logic. But we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Now, as I mentioned, Zalamea's genealogy is not thematic, but it is simply a series of names that go sequentially. And so there is no real organization or, let's say, link that binds these names together other than the fact that they are precisely universalist, right? So my own periodization, as we will see, draws rather from a historical, let's say, periodization, but also from a theoretical organization. And I will be, in doing so, drawing from very different sources. I will have some chance to see what these are. But I think probably the most important one is one given by another philosopher that we will be reading, who is Leopoldo Sea from Mexico, who is often considered, and I think rightly so, the great master, the most important figure of what we will name also the historicist moment of the universalist philosophical canon. And in a very, very important text of his, although it's not one of his most read texts, I should say, and it's relatively underappreciated. It's a crime against humanity that Saya's works have not been translated as a whole, except a few essays here and there and a couple of books. He was extraordinarily prolific also, so this is no surprise that most of his works would remain untranslated, but even his most important works have remained untranslated. In any case, the work in question is Filosofía de la Historia Americana, Philosophy of American History, from 1978, a relatively late work from Saya. And in this work, he, let's say, distillates what he had been working really since the beginning of his work, since El Positivismo en Mexico, which is an attempt to think of Latin American history and the development of Latin American thought and philosophy in a kind of periodization. And in this work, he does so by conceiving or isolating what he names different projects. So it's a genealogy that separates between different projects, which begin with the colonial period, but which continue to unfold all the way until the 20th century. And this genealogy of projects, which will occupy, so we'll begin by talking a little bit about the broad genealogy. We will have a chance to talk about Saya's own, let's say, philosophical ideas and what this genealogy more importantly means later. But for now, let me just say that this genealogy of Saya, of the projects of different Latin American moments in history, is of central interest. Now, what are these projects? These projects are, let's say, loosely conceived, let's say, moments in which specific theoretical ideals and principles were adopted by Latin American thinkers, writers, and activists to think not only of the means for describing Latin American social reality, but also to try to imagine a kind of projected horizon to think about the future of Latin America. What should Latin America be? There's always going to be this simultaneous question, a descriptive task and a prescriptive task. The descriptive task is, what theoretical resources do we need, Latin American thinkers, philosophers, to describe the social reality and the historical experience that defines Latin America uniquely as a space? And on the other hand, what should Latin America aspire to be? Once we have attained independence from Europe, once we have become freed from colonial rule, nevertheless, the question arises, what should the Latin America of the future that we want to be? And in this context, these two complementary tasks will give rise to different configurations and projects. And these different projects, as we will see, draw from very different sources, have very different ideals, but nevertheless all share the simultaneous idea that Latin America is nevertheless a kind of precisely something that is yet to be, something that needs to be realized. But in order for us to be able to actually realize this ideal of what Latin America could be, we first need to find the theoretical resources to describe its own history and reality. And this genealogy, as we will see, culminates, according to Saya's genealogy, in a fourth project, major project. There's subdivisions that I will not get into in his own periodization for reasons of time, but it culminates in what is named the Assumptive Project. And the Assumptive Project is properly where our story will begin, the Assumptive Project of the 20th century. Now, let me just briefly rehearse, again, in a very coarse-grained manner, since we want to get to the meaty stuff, the genealogy that Saya proposes of the different projects. The first project that he describes is the so-called Hispanic project of the 16th century. And this coincides with the colonial venture of the Iberian Empire during the so-called Age of Discovery, as we know, and the process of conquest and colonization since 1492. Now, this process, as obviously everybody here knows, coincides not only with the arrival, conquest, domination of the Iberian Empire and its ventures into the Latin American territory, beginning with the Caribbean, but also begins a process of evangelization, a process of imposition and, let's say, cultural, enforcement of the Christian worldview. But also, and importantly, since very early on, the organization of the colonies had it for itself to impose and a scholastic, essentially, organization of the pedagogical process that was going to take place. Scholasticism was, let's say, the lingua franca, the philosophical lingua franca of the so-called Hispanic project of colonization. Now, much literature since has tried to, of course, refine this. This is a very broad brush characterization. A scholasticism as a house with many mansions, and it was the same during the long period that we define as the colonial period in Latin America. There were several, let's say, competing interests, schools of thought, and scholasticism, as you know, has internal debates that are significant import. But this won't occupy us because our genealogy, our own proper, let's say, investigation begins later. But nevertheless, let's say there's this big constellation that say identifies this is the first project, the Hispanic project or colonial project, you can call it. Second is the project of liberty from the 18th century. And this one consisted in the abolition of the colonial past, basically through an adoption, broadly, of Enlightenment European ideals, mostly carried by Creole elites, Creole aristocracy, and in some cases, let's say, progressive mestizo thinkers, but mostly by the Creole elites. And this was based around a rejection of the Iberian, not just imperial rule, but also this Christian civilization that had been imposed in its scholastic mode of teaching. And it was not entirely decided, and one of the things that I presume some of you might know is that Bolivar, the great libertador, in the wake of the independence movements, in his famous Jamaica letter, for example, expresses a great deal of anxiety for the fact that even though the wars of independence are taking place, nevertheless, the prospects for a unified Latin America appear tenuous. And indeed, there was much division during this time. Much literature since, much of what is called the revisionary reading of history against this version that is presented by Sea, also complicates this diagnosis. The diagnosis that it was an adoption of Enlightenment modern ideals that set itself against the Iberian Empire. And this is because there was already a kind of progressivist tendency already coming from Spain itself in the courts of Cadiz, but also internally there was much, let's say, inconsistency between Latin American, independentists, not necessarily, but because of an alignment with Enlightenment values. And indeed, as we know, much of what resulted from the independence processes was not necessarily aligned to the ideas of, let's say, modern republicanism or let alone liberalism, but it oftentimes devolved into new forms of monarchic rule and anarchy. Now, this project, which was, according to Sea, broadly construed, nevertheless, a rejection of the Iberian rule through the adoption of modern ideals, Enlightenment ideals, would be extended in the period after the wars of independence had completed, which roughly had, let's say, most of them had completed by 1830. But after this moment, these would continue with this enthusiasm of, let's say, a naive sort, which would lead to a period of catastrophe, essentially. Anarchy, let's say, political instability across the continent, fragile republican regimes, all sorts of attempts to take power by force across the board. There's a period of chaos that leads precisely to the next important step. And that is the project of liberty. Sorry, the project of liberty to what I call the civilizing project, or what Sea calls the civilizing project. So this is what Sea describes. This is a fragment from Sea that describes the project of liberty in its fundamentals. The project of liberty arises as the reaction of European modernity against the old Christian project, the colonial Hispanic project, right? Its expression will be the confrontation between Christianity and modernity. This modernity is summed up in the European project, which will have as its goal the hegemony over the planet, and with it opposing the Iberian imperialism. So it's already an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial project in alignment, Sea goes, with European modernity. And then after this period of independence is completed, We didn't get the sought for utopian idea of a consolidated set of nations or a unified Latin America, but chaos, anarchy, monarchy, weak republics, instability, political across the continent, lack of unity. And this gives rise in the mid to late 19th century to what Sea calls the civilizing project. Now, this one is of more interest to us because it forms the preamble, let's say, or the condition for the rise of the tradition, the universalist traditions that we will be discussing. Because as we will see, and to a large extent, the traditions that I named universalist in the 20th century, which will coincide with the fourth stage of Sea's genealogy, emerge largely as a reaction against this civilizing project. Now, the civilizing project has many faces, but I think perhaps the most emblematic, let's say, representatives can be identified in the so-called generation of 1838. People like Sarmiento, Alberdi, Echeverria, and Lastarria from Chile. All these figures, surprisingly enough, would continue to radicalize this anti-Iberian impulse. But the idea would be that it was not sufficient to have achieved political independence from the old colonial power. There was a pending task, a more important task, in fact, which was to achieve what was called mental emancipation. Mental emancipation. The idea is very simple and almost intuitive, right? We are now free from the Iberian masters, yes, but nevertheless, we remain hostage to them insofar as we are still reproducing their economic systems, their political, let's say, faults and vices, right? We are still feudal. We are still, colonial and pre-modern in our minds. Until we're able to become mentally emancipated from this, let's say, baggage, we will not be able to truly become independent. This idea of mental independence is therefore conceived as a kind of extension of the process of political and economic independence. And for the members of the Civilizing Project, this means that there needs to be now a reform in thought, fundamentally. This is why this moment is of peculiar importance, because it coincides not only with now a demand for a new form of, let's say, political and economic organization, which for the members of the Civilizing Project will be liberal capitalist, let's say, republicanism. But furthermore, it will shift the attention and the locus from which Latin American thinkers will draw inspiration. And it will be this time no longer, let's say, the old scholastic philosophical sources or Enlightenment principles in general coming from Western Europe, but largely the United States, because the United States had proven to be successful in the post-independence period at consolidating unity, prosperity, economic development. And in this regard, there will be a, let's say, tenuous but also interesting merger of the philosophy of positivism that had begun to flourish in Europe, but which the Latin American thinkers, specifically the work of Comte, and then Spencerian evolutionism, and also John Stuart Mill's psychologism and utilitarianism. These three philosophical trends, I should also mention Krausism, would all become appropriated within Latin America to think about the conditions for civilization. A civilizatory movement, which would coincide with the process of urban modernization, which was, however, to be, as you can probably imagine, reserved for a new and growing bourgeoisie and for essentially mestizo and Creole elites. In fact, even the mestizo is sort of delegated to a second order citizen, never mind the indigenous populations, right? The Indio is here, strictly speaking, considered fodder, barbarism, as we will say. Now, something that's important about this is that all these projects that we have discussed so far, the first three projects, right? The Hispanic project of colonization, the project of liberation, and the civilizing project, all of them, tells us, incur in what he calls following the work of Antonio Caso, who is one of the thinkers that belongs to the Athenaeum of the Youth, which we will discuss later, incurring what he calls bovarismo, bovarism, a term that, of course, Caso develops, borrowing from Flaubert, or rather inspired by Flaubert. Madame Bovary, always, of course, dreaming with this kind of, let's say, class guilt to be something other than she is, looking at something beyond herself. Latin America, according to Caso, always conceives of itself, searches for itself. It's uneasy in its own shoes. It feels a sense of rejection with regards to its own past. It doesn't identify with itself, and it looks outside of itself to Europe, to the United States, to philosophies that are foreign to itself for a solution to its own problems. It always keeps doing this, regardless of the different projects. And according to Sea, this is something we will see in a little bit, but this is actually Sea's own take on this, is that this has led to a kind of process of what I will call dialectical failure. There's a dialectical failure that occurs because precisely there's this, let's say, mimetic dependency on other sources, on other, let's say, foreign experiences, philosophies, and so on. But in any case, the fourth project, which, just to summarize the genealogy from Sea, is what he names the Assumptive Project. I say 1990, but it should be 1900 here. So please, that's just a typo, okay? I will correct it in due course. The Assumptive Project of the 1900, which begins with the so-called generation of the 1900. And in this generation, we usually pile in people from actually very different experiences and orientations of thought, but perhaps the most important two names are José Enrique Rodó from Uruguay and José Martí from Cuba. Now, what this project essentially presented was a project in which we would cease finally, Latin America would cease to finally be simply in a relationship of mimetic dependency in relation to foreign sources, and would actually relate to the other, the European and North American other, or the United States, with a relation of creative appropriation, as opposed to just simply mimetic dependency. And it would be also a moment in which there would be very clearly a vindication of the experience of mestizaje and a vindication of the Amerindian legacy and ethnicity of the continent itself. This is already very, very, very forcefully voiced in the works of Martí, more so than in the works of Rodó, but it's also present in other works by other thinkers, Manuel González Prada and Francisco García Calderón, for example, from Peru, where I'm from, by the way, yay. Also, all of them voice to more or less, to a greater or lesser degree, the necessity of making of the mestizo the kind of cultural hero of Latin American history, since it's its distinctive subject, and also of incorporating the rural Indian into the nation building projects, and finally into the continental projects. Now, this project, which again begins in the generation of 1900, and this will be exactly where we will begin actually, is later developed. It also develops shortly after in the generation of 1915, which coincides roughly with the constellation of thought that we will be talking about, which is that of the Athenaeum of the Youth, which was later also called the Athenaeum of Mexico, which was a think tank, really, that was composed or agglutinated in Mexico, at first in alignment with El Porfiriato, the regime of Porfirio Diaz, but after the revolution, it actually formed in 1909, right in the wake of the Mexican Revolution, it would begin to shift gears. And it will start to think about other possibilities in a different future for Mexico. And in this group, which is, I think, the most interesting, let's say, integral constellation of thought of this first expression and stage of the Assumptive Project, you have thinkers like Alfonso Reyes, Max and Pedro Enriquez Ureña, the brothers, Antonio Caso, who we mentioned before, who is the one who coined bovarismo, and José Vasconcelos. I'll have more to say about each of these figures later. Now, more generally, so I've just mentioned a few names and a few sort of historical indications. It was very clearly a reaction against the civilizing project this kind of reverential attitude towards the United States, this idea that simply a model for civilization could be pursued, derogating and relinquishing the mestizo and the Amerindian heritage, adopting a coarse liberal capitalist project of modernization while relinquishing the disinterested pursuits of culture. And furthermore, what they will say is that this idea of achieving mental independence from the colonial past, from the European Iberian colonial legacy, had to be extended into what I will say is precisely cultural emancipation. It's not just mental emancipation at the level of the psychology of the individual, but also there needed to be a kind of collective emancipation at the level of culture. But because the civilizing project, the thinkers of the Assumptive Project will say, remained in this quote unquote utilitarian mindset, that the only conception that mattered of progress was that of economic progress, they relinquished the interest of culture, the disinterested pursuits of culture, which should be, in fact, the foundations for reconstituting and building a true Latin American identity. So you see, we move from first political economic independence, which is, of course, the project of liberty, to the idea that no, we need something more fundamental, which is mental independence, to finally culture. Culture is where it's decided. The true independence begins in culture. And it's here that we will see the first version of this precise term, which is what I'm, let's say, formulating as a hypothesis, as a working hypothesis, which is that here is where the labor of unlimited transcultural synthesis takes place. The kind of culture that members of the Assumptive Project will envisage is not just a culture that will be called Latin American, autochthonous, based on its own historical experiences, reality, and ethnic heritage. But it will be furthermore humanist, cosmopolitan, multiculturalist, democratic. It would be essentially an attempt to extend the idea of mestizaje from a purely ethnic, let's say, conception to one which is more broadly conceived as one of cultural, let's say, hybridity and synthesis. Mestizaje conceived as a horizon for multicultural synthesis. And this will be, in fact, the first version of the project, of this universalist imagination or imaginary that I will discuss. And I will be discussing this apropos Rodó specifically, since he, I think, voices with supreme delicacy this project in a very, very, let's say, interesting way. And I will talk more about the philosophical sources that go into this and the philosophical ideas proper. But just keep in mind, the general gist of this first version is the ideal of a multicultural, cosmopolitan, democratic civilization that will, quote unquote, allow Latin America to achieve cultural independence and not just mental independence, and overcome, therefore, the kind, what Rodó will call the nordomania, this fetishism with the United States that had characterized the thought of the civilizing project before itself. Now, let me stop there for 1 second just to check in with the group. How are we doing? All good? Yes? All right, great. Let me refill my coffee and we can move along. Also, feel free at any moment if you have any questions, and I'm in the middle of an exposition, but you want to drop them in the chat or comments, more than happy to do so. Let me resume. Now, there are two historical events that conditioned the emergence of the Assumptive Project in Latin America in the 1900s, and this violent reaction against the civilizing project. The first is the Cuban War of Independence from 1898, which of course was very much behind everything that Martí, one of the two, I think, great founders of the movement, everything that he ever wrote was marked by the conception of thinking of this situation. And the second is the Mexican Revolution of 1910, which would also condition very strongly the constellation of thought that I've described as forming the Athenaeum of the youth in Mexico, but which included thinkers that were not all Mexican, including, I should say, for example, Diego Rivera was there. One of the great proponents of Mexican muralismo was part of the Athenaeum. Now, the Cuban War of Independence was a very important moment in the shift of the attitude that Latin America had in relation to the United States, right? You might know something about the Monroe Doctrine. There was this, of course, always tenuous relationship to the idea that, are we an America? Can we trust the northern neighbor? To the point where it becomes clear that the United States represented, in fact, the new colonial imperial threat for Latin American sovereignty. So it was a decisive shift, whereas members from the Civilizing Project not only revered the United States, and you find statements very clearly, of this sort. Specifically, if you look at someone like Bilbao, is more ambiguous. Sarmiento, very reverential. Alberdi, again, with more ambiguity. But in general, there's this admiration towards the United States. And Sarmiento will go very far in this line. He will say that, in fact, we shouldn't just imitate the United States, but we should actually bring as many people from the United States as possible to cleanse our ethnic stock, to whitewash, literally, the Latin American blood and rid it from its mestizo, gauchesco, and indigenous pollution. In any case, the members of the Assumptive Project begin to actually much more frontally confront the idea that, in fact, it is no longer a repudiation of the Iberian colonial past that needs to take place. On the contrary, now the imperial and colonial threat is the United States. And rather than trying to erase our Iberian heritage, right, we should appropriate it. We should own it. The colonial experience, with all its violence, with all its disgusting sides, nevertheless harbors something unique about it that places us Latin Americans in distinction, or makes us different than the North American neighbor. And this will be actually very, very clearly voiced in the works of Rodin, already in Ariel, where he will say something that, in fact, Latin America, and this kind of crazy nationalism is very reminiscent of German Romanticism, is actually the harbinger, inheritor of the legacy of Greek Athenian democracy and Greek thought. And he will actually say this very, very, very clearly. We'll see later. And the other thing that's very important is that the idea that civilization, modernization was to be reserved for this growing bourgeois elites, that idea was becoming more and more, unstable. The members of the Civilizing Project, Sarmiento included, who, as you know, was president, who had achieved, in many cases, great prosperity in economic development and technological development and urban development. Nevertheless, progress and order and civilization was reserved and seen only for a small minority. And the great majority of disenfranchised essentially became disillusioned with the project. So this wasn't just a matter of there's this international conflictive stage, and there is, a quarrel between intellectuals. There's a sense of public unrest within Latin American nations that call for a new way of thinking, a new mode of thought. So we needed a rupture with the Civilizing Project, and therefore there was a new demand for a new philosophy also. A new philosophy that would be different than the positivist, Krausist, utilitarian philosophies that had been appropriated in the continent, again, always in alignment with the idea of the United States as a goal or ideal. And something that comes here for the first time is this concept that you might know is famously coined and developed by Chakrabarty, which is the idea of an alternative modernity. Here, it becomes more, transparent that what Latin America needed was not simply to imitate the modern process that had sort of characterized the developmental cycles of other nations, but look for its own modernity. A modernity that would not only not incur in the failures and problems that European modernity had incurred, but also the United States, which was going to become now pathologized as being a kind of Philistine culture without a soul, without true culture. You know, there's this cliche, it's very popular in Latin America, that, you know, los gringos no tienen cultura, you know, the United States, they don't have a culture of their own. This actually has a very, very, let's say, a veritable heritage, even though it seems like a very crass and dumb thing to say. And we will see, actually, Rodolfo give you the most like ornate version of this, let's say, narrative. Here's a quote by Santiago Castro Gomez. Santiago Castro Gomez is actually one of the most interesting philosophers working still today in Latin America. He's from Colombia as well. And he wrote a very influential book really when he was quite young. Fortunately, this one is translated. This was published in, well, the translation, I don't recall exactly, but the original was in 1993. Again, he was very young. And in this book, the critique of Latin American reason, he proposes, again, a sort of conceptual genealogy of Latin American thought in its development, but with a critical Foucauldian methodology and lens to sort of assess it in its different moments. It's a really great book. I really recommend it. We won't be reading this, unfortunately, but I will be citing this book quite frequently. Quote, as a result of the United States' repeated interventions in the Caribbean in the late 19th century, the new urban bourgeoisie and intellectuals began to realize the need to politically challenge the economic and military expansion of the large nation of the North. Thus, a nationalist Latin American spirit began to develop, first appearing in the Mexican Revolution of 1910. I would say that this is slightly factually inaccurate, or already this was seen in 1898 with the Cuban independence movement. Demand for national sovereignty, the socialization of private property, centralization of political power, the protective leadership of the state, import substitutions, the cult of heroes and caudillos. Caudillo, by the way, is a term that is used frequently in Latin America and in Spanish to designate this kind of populist cult of personality around the leader, right? Which is canonically this kind of patriarchal, oftentimes military, you know, sort of a strong man that is demanded for. Were all policies adopted for the first time in Mexico and then later adopted by other Latin American countries during the first half of the 20th century. And this historical diagnosis coincides with Sea's, let's say, description of the beginning first formative phase of the assumptive project. Thus, and here we have another quote from Sea, this time from another book of his, important, Dialectic of Latin American Consciousness, Dialéctica de la Conciencia Americana, or Latinoamericana. And the quote goes, "It would be from America and in America that the spirit, conscious of a larger freedom, would confront itself in order to give birth to a new humanity. It will be this struggle that gives meaning to the history of Latin America in the 20th century, a history that will transcend its natural borders as part of a larger history in which the final destiny of humanity will be judged. In the demands for freedom born in Latin America, many other peoples will find meaning of their own demands." Or this was the aspiration, I should say. This is not a description, right? The description was that Latin America was a kind of metonymic example, or it will serve as an example of what a general process of human liberation and democratization will look like. In other words, Latin America becomes, as it always has been, right, since the early conquistadores projected into Latin America all these utopian visions, right? But Latin America in its Republican period and in the Assumptive Project will also be the site of a new utopian image, which is precisely this image of a humanist, cosmopolitan, modern culture. A culture that would reconcile the kind of cold, rationalist, utilitarian spirit that had been emphasized through the adoption of positivism by adherents of the civilizing project with this kind of culturalist impetus and the romanticist culturalist impetus that was coming from the members of the Assumptive Project. It would be therefore something like a synthesis of romanticism and positivism, which were the two trends that had been in conflict before. And therefore also a synthesis between the quote-unquote more progressive tendencies and the conservative tendencies. In fact, Sea makes a subsidiary distinction between leading to the the assumptive project, between the conservative project, which was much more trying to go back to Iberian principles and organization to respond to the chaos of the nascent republics, and the civilizing project, which developed alongside it, and which was the progressive, liberal, republicanist side. In any case, the other thing that's important about this quote is this first point, which emphasizes the idea of a consciousness of a larger freedom. Here is where you can begin to understand, we'll talk about this next week. Sea is very much a Hegelian, and Sea actually reconstructs this typology of the projects, and the history of Latin American thought is actually an appropriation of the Hegelian dialectic that explains Latin America as coming to a kind of point of self-consciousness where it reappropriates its past as opposed to disavows it. And I'll talk a little bit about this because I think there's a really important point to be made here that will also inform how I will be reading these traditions. So here begins our story, or the story that I want to tell, right? Which is really the history of this thing that Sea calls the assumptive project. The idea that Latin America is a kind of privileged side, laboratory space for a kind of new, universal, multicultural, democratic culture. And therefore that it is a side, and it has an opportunity and a task not only to overcome the shackles from the colonial past, the mental habits, to achieve mental independence and cultural independence, but it would also, and this is the interesting part, the more interesting part, is that these thinkers would think of Latin America as an opportunity and the place where the project of European modernity, originally formulated in Europe, of course, in the Enlightenment, would be realized. That where Europe failed, Latin America would get it right. And the reason why it could do this is that it would finally be relieved, that is to say, the project of modernity, from any kind of regionalist bias that would limit its scope, the scope of the realization of human freedom. In fact, the diagnosis will be, and this will be much more clearly formulated and thematized in the third configuration of universalist thought already in the 60s in the philosophy of liberation, but the idea would be that the reason why European modernity fails is precisely because of its Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism and this kind of particularist bias had to inevitably frustrate the aspirations toward universality that the modern project inaugurated in Europe, launched. So therefore, Latin America would be able to truly set the foundations for a universal culture that would not just be Latin American, right? Or that rather, and this is the, of course, dialectical trickery, that to be Latin America is precisely to be universal, right? To not be just simply itself, but furthermore, to be completely open, a subject completely open to hybridity and synthesis. So it is really a project of what we call alternative modernity, or projects of alternative modernity. And my own periodization, which is the periodization that we will be following to examine the development of this constellation, has really 5 stages. These 5 stages will correspond in the book to 5 chapters, but allow me to just simply briefly rehearse the 5 that we will be talking about. So the first is what I called the Arielist or Arielista tradition, with which I incorporate, and for good reasons, as we will see, the Athenaeum of the youth, essentially beginning in the 1900s, extending roughly until the 1920s. Again, I've mentioned a few of the founding figures, Martí and Rodó specifically, but also I think as spiritual leaders, it's of utmost importance to mention the influence of Rubén Darío and the modernista aesthetics and literature, and especially in the realm of poetry that began to develop at the time. Modernismo was also considered to be the first, let's say, movement and expression of a Latin American, a truly Latin American, let's say, literary form. And Darío was at the forefront of this. And Rodó and Darío, there was this synergetic and also conflictive relationship between them concerning precisely how it is that Latin America should achieve this project of cultural independence. And we'll have something to say about this relationship when we look at a passage. Now, The basic, let's say, sources that inform here are, as we've seen already, it's a humanist project. It is a universalist project, clearly, that believes in this kind of complete openness of Latin America to mestizaje, to a process of mestizaje that would be completely unrestricted, multiculturalist, therefore. It was inspired very strongly by French vitalism, specifically Bergson, spiritualism, Boutreau, and others. Different forms of eclecticism and obscurantism and mysticism and occultism, as we will see in the case of Darío, and also German Romanticism. It spans these two generations, the generation of 1900 and the generation of 1915. And this tradition, for the first time, was characterized, and this is again something that Sea will say very forcefully, will be characterized by, rather than trying to simply annihilate and ignore the Iberian and colonial past and its legacy, to try to reappropriate it. And it will be a kind of cosmopolitan project, right? That will be very, very clearly expressed, I think, in its most, utopian version, both by Alfonso Reyes and by Pedro Enrique Sureña, but also by Vasconcelos. And it is actually very clearly at this point already also a response to the perceived escalating European crisis of modernity. The European crisis of modernity, which of course will find its, let's say, exploding threshold or its phase shift in the First World War. So again, the search for cultural emancipation extends the search for mental emancipation. Cultural emancipation also implies the extension of the concept of mestizaje to cultural mestizaje or hybridity, and this becomes the foundation for a universalist, humanist, democratic culture. That's the core. The second constellation is the revolutionary indigenista tradition, which we can say extends or has its most important developments from roughly in the 1920s to the 1960s. It's a long history. Incidentally, these are not neatly separated chunks of history, but they overlap in significant moments. And in fact, though in this seminar we'll be focusing on the philosophical literature for the most part, we'll see that many of the figures were not only philosophers, properly speaking, or thinkers or intellectuals. They were also, engaged in literary writing, and also many of them belong to more than one tradition at once, or they transition from one into the other. This already you can see in the transition, from the Civilizing Project to the Assumptive Project, or from the Liberty Project to the Civilizing Project. Sarmiento, before he was a positivist, he was an adherent of Enlightenment romantic ideals, and Justo Sierra was a positivist, then became disillusioned with positivism, and so on and so forth. So the revolutionary indigenista tradition was heralded by a variety of thinkers, again, partially philosophers, partially poets and literature writers. Mariano Azuela, José Carlos Mariátegui, Víctor Raúl Aya de la Torre, Gamaliel Churata, César Vallejo, Luis Valcárcel, Alcides Arguedas, Ciro Alegría, José María Arguedas, and many others. I should also mention here, of course, Clorinda Mato de Turner. Now, this also comprises part of the 1915 generation. In fact, Mariátegui is oftentimes considered to be part of that 1915 generation. And I think in this regard, the genealogy that is proposed more traditionally suffers precisely from a focus on the generational part of it, and not so much from the thematic and conceptual part of it, because there's a sense in which, even though Mariátegui belongs to the generation of 1915, and therefore you can place him along all the other guys from the Athenaeum, right? Even though he wasn't part of the Athenaeum. But nevertheless, I think his heritage is actually much more closely aligned to something like Martí, who had a revolutionary image of political emancipation, who much more actively thought about not only the place of the mestizo, but of the indio in the tasks of nation building, and which therefore departs, I think, significantly from those versions of the Assumptive Project, which were constitutively liberal in tenor. The project that was heralded by Rodó and by other members of the Athenaeum was constitutively still a capitalist, liberal, modern future. But the revolutionary indigenista tradition that I'm delineating here was characterized by drawing from a different lineage. Yes, in many ways the same. There was, the influence of Bergsonist vitalism, spiritualism, But also there was a great influence from, for example, Italian syndicalism. There was also a great influence already as this develops of Ortega y Gasset's circumstantialism and rational vitalism, and of course Marxism. Marxism becomes and enters the fore very strongly for this tradition. So we have a kind of different also set of philosophical reference. And I'm going to be talking about this tradition next time in tandem with the third tradition, which is the tradition that I will call the historicist tradition. But one final point to make about the second tradition is that one of the claims that, and we will be reading Mariátegi's, obviously the 7 essays, but part of it, not the whole thing, it would be possible. But one of the points that Mariátegui makes here in this version of the assumptive project is that actually Latin America does not only have this opportunity to realize the modern European dream, but furthermore, it has the capacity to realize the communist socialist dream without having to go through the dialectic of passing from a feudal to a capitalist stage. In other words, Latin American nations, Mariátegui will argue, had remained constitutively feudal in character, semi-feudal at least, because in the countryside, in the rural areas, el latifundio, the landlord oligarchies, had still remained. And these remained the backbone of the economic structures of the nations. But the idea that we had to sort of first go through the phases of urban liberal capitalist modernization to then eventually migrate into a socialist revolution, Mariátegui thought was perhaps not right, that we could go directly to a kind of socialism, a socialism, incidentally, that would be informed by not only the ideas of Marxism and egalitarian politics and so on, but that would rekindle latent potentials in the agrarian modes of production that were present already in the Andes and that had existed before the arrival of the Europeans. The third tradition is what I name the historicist tradition, which includes the works of José Gaos, of Leopoldo Sea, and also the group, the think tank that was called El Grupo Hyperion, the Hyperion group. Between roughly 1940 and 1960, you can actually drag it a little back and a little forward. But here, I think the most important figure will be Leopoldo Sea, again, but also the works of the Hyperion group, which was also based in Mexico, formed in 1948, which included works and figures of actually this is very unfortunate that many of these figures have been sort of relinquished to the oblivion of history. Emilio Uranga, Luis Villoro, Jorge Portilla, and a few others. And also I include in this tradition, this historicist tradition, the works of people like Arturo Ardao and Edmundo O'Gorman, of which I will have more to say in due course. Historicism essentially gestates or begins to gestate in the 1930s and really takes off in the 1940s. It was very much strongly inspired by Ortega y Gasset, the circumstantialism and perspectivism of Ortega y Gasset, but it was very much influential because of the influx of this thought that came from Europe, specifically through the experience of what is called the Spanish transterrados, which were the European exiles that fled from Franco's fascist regime at the end of the 30s and that settled in different places in Latin America, Argentina and Mexico in particular. And specifically the influence of José Gaos in Mexico was of extraordinary importance. Now, José Gaos was not only someone who advocated and brought much of the thought of Ortega to the continent, but he was also an illustrious thinker who brought many other things besides, and the Transterrados in general brought many other trends into the continent. The thought of Dilthey, and of course, this emphasis and sort of priority and given to the sciences of the spirit or the human sciences. Heideggerian phenomenology came into the fore very strongly in this way. In fact, José Gaos, some of you might know, was the guy who first translated Being and Time into Spanish, and what is considered to be one of the worst translations ever made by any book ever made. If you want to read something that is actually unintelligible, I mean, if you think Heidegger is hard enough, go read Gaos. Those of you who speak Spanish, you can try to read that translation, and I don't think there's ever been a worse translation of any text, except maybe the contributions of philosophy from Heidegger to the English, the first one. That was also terrible. Anyway, Sartrean existentialism also came into the fore. Hegelian dialectics was much more strongly here adopted. In the earlier stages, like the revolutionary indigenista tradition, of course, already had, they were Marxists, historical materialism played a big role there. But Hegelian dialectics had always been considered, because of its idealist sort of inflection, for them sort of retrograde and backwards. On the other hand, in the historicist tradition, Hegelian dialectics plays a very active role, specifically in the case of Sea, but also Gauss actually has a Hegelian sort of turn towards the end. And another really important influence here is what is called the history of ideas, which is actually a, let's say, trend within the field of history proper, kind of intellectual history, which was the idea, of course, of doing a kind of genealogical survey of the development of specifically philosophical concepts as they developed and as they were, let's say, transmitted. The history of ideas was also very much influenced itself by the emergent, quote unquote, hermeneutic and genealogical methods of the post-phenomenological Heidegger and so on. Anyway, Marxism was also continued to be very important for this constellation of thought. And the other thing that's important to just note provisionally about this tradition is that this tradition coincides with actually what Francisco Romero, who's an Argentine philosopher, one of the most important philosophers mediating this kind of transitionary period, would name the generation of forgers and their disciples. We're going to see this genealogy that Romero, Miro Quesada, and others sort of sketch for us. But the idea that is presented is it's in this tradition that the idea of Latin American philosophy becomes a topic of debate, a very, very explicit topic of debate. A topic of debate that will begin with formulations and statements and proclamations by people like Gauss, by Sea, and then we'll have at its summit a tenuous and difficult debate between Leopoldo Sea and Augusto Salazar-Bondi, which actually is one of the most important moments, I think, in prefiguring the kind of debates that will ensue after. The reason why this is important is not just anecdotal. It's because it is the moment in which Latin American thinkers began to actually think of the necessity of professionalizing philosophy. Philosophy had been practiced outside of an academic professional context properly. You think of people like Rodó, you think about the people in the Ateneo, like Vasconcelos and so on. They, of course, they worked, and oftentimes they held political office or were diplomats, journalists. They occupy themselves with all kinds of things. But philosophy departments in universities, right? This thing was not really the way that philosophy was majorly practiced, at least not the major philosophers that existed until that point. This led many to believe that philosophy, in fact, had not existed in the continent before. And that indeed, the reason for that was that there were no institutional, professional conditions for philosophy proper to have flourished. What you had were these kind of scatterbrained sort of appropriations of ideas here and there, but nothing like a consistent philosophical tradition. And Romero, among others, thinks that, in fact, this means that what is needed is a process of what he called normalization, where philosophy becomes a kind of thing, just like we do today, where, students and generations come in and they're taught. Professors are well learned comprehensively in the history of philosophy, which, of course, for them meant the history of European philosophy at this point. And then they were able to think for themselves eventually, but that this would take some time. That, in other words, this was still a task to be prepared. There were others, however, like Sea, who claimed that, in fact, no, there had been a Latin American philosophy, that this task, surely enough, of professionalization and so on, laudable as it might be, nevertheless elides the fact that there existed already a tradition of philosophy in Latin America despite everything else, and therefore this yields a debate concerning, has there been a Latin American philosophy? What does it mean to be a Latin American philosophy? Is philosophy just philosophy, and whether Latin Americans practice it or not doesn't really matter? You can sort of get the gist of the kind of debates a little bit. The next constellation of thought is of very particular importance. It's the theology and the philosophy of liberation, which begins to flourish since the 60s and continues to transpire, in fact, until today, but really has its apex until the 80s and even into the 90s. It was the term theology of liberation was actually coined by a Peruvian priest, Gustavo Gutierrez, who just passed away actually a few days ago, unfortunately. It was coined in 1971. And then in parallel, although it's still very much influenced by theological, let's say, registers, the philosophy of liberation, which what we will be talking about, develops more or less in parallel and has as its most illustrious representative figure Enrique Dussel. But also we should mention here several other names: Juan Carlos Canone, Arturo Roig, Horacio Ceruti, Rodolfo Kusch, which I think is an odd cat there that I would rather not talk about. And also Leopoldo Sea actually would later in his life adhere himself to the liberationist project, much like Dussel will later attach himself to the decolonial project. So there's again this kind of they don't just belong to one tradition. Now, there's a lot of different influences that come here. First of all, Prebisch's dependency theory becomes extremely important to theorize the place of Latin America as a periphery in relation to the European center. Again, the influence of Heideggerian phenomenology becomes extremely important. And it's very, very present in Rodolfo Kusch's autochtonism, to think of an ontology of the estar as opposed to the ser. And also in Dussel's own work, which is very much influenced by Heidegger, but also by the work of Levinas. So Levinasian ethics also comes here into the fore. The prioritization of ethics here is very, very strong. In fact, this prioritization of ethics is something that you can already see in the work of Rodolfo, for example, but understanding ethics in a very different way. There's also the influence of Wallerstein, world systems theory, Marx, although a very heterodox Marx, as we will see. And it is here in this moment that this critique of Eurocentrism becomes explicitly formulated, and Eurocentrism becomes a concept. And there's an interesting here reversal where Dussel eventually comes to this, again, following Wallerstein and Prebisch, or developing from ideas of them, the idea that, in fact, European modernity, as it is reconstructed in the classroom, is actually a Eurocentric idea of modernity. That, yes, there was a sense in which Europe was at the epicenter of the modern process, but that, in fact, modernity really begins in 1492. It begins with the colonial excursion into the Americas, which establishes the first proper world system. That is the birth of modernity. So there's going to be a contrast, as we will see in Dussel, between the so-called Eurocentric concept of modernity and the planetary concept of modernity, which for him is part of what is needed as a kind of, let's say, historical revisionism or revisionist task to get us to think truly about how modernity functions, what are its limits and possibilities still. What's interesting about this trajectory also, as we will see, is that it in a certain way continues very overtly also paying homage to the legacy of the revolutionary indigenista tradition and, of course, revolutionary liberationist ideas that were already present since Martí. But it will also seek to much more actively incorporate into its program of liberation and the attempt to think from the side of the oppressed, the marginalized, groups that until this point had not been featured prominently in the rhetoric. Not just the indigenous populations, native populations of Latin America, but Afro-American populations and their descendants. Feminist struggle becomes actively incorporated finally into a kind of philosophical program. And also the surplus populations that had emerged as the excrescences of the growing urban spaces of Latin America. Favelas, shanty towns, as we used to call them, slums, and so on and so forth. So there will be a much more comprehensive front, not just the working class and the agrarian working class, the rural Indio, but all these other groups that will form part of the liberationist front. So again, to philosophize from the periphery. And Incidentally, I should just say before, this will yield a new concept of modernity, of alternative modernity in Dussel, which he will call transmodernity. Dussel originally adopted postmodernity, but then postmodernity ended up meaning something completely different, in the European tradition. And so he used transmodernity ever since. And we'll talk about what that is in its due course. Now, this tradition, and here's a coda, a sort of transitionary thing. This tradition would be largely radicalized and taken in a new direction by adherents of the so-called decolonial turn, and specifically the group Modernity Coloniality, which congeals in the 90s. Now, this is a very important constellation of thought. Today, there's a lot of debate about decoloniality and decolonial theory and the decolonial turn, decolonial epistemologies, whatever you want. And I think there's due controversy, and we will have a chance to talk about this, hopefully. But the group so-called Modernity Coloniality, which organized itself in the 90s, was largely composed of people that were adherents to the philosophy of liberation, including Dussel, but which began to take the conversation in a new direction. There was a new emphasis, of course, a revisiting of the concept of colonialism, and specifically an emphasis on the racial and ethnic factor and how it had played a decisive role in the process of colonization and the organization of the colonial order. This is very much the emphasis that was put forward by Aníbal Quijano, the Peruvian philosopher who actually, I think, did the most to really define the decolonial turn as a thing in itself. But then there's also this emphasis on an epistemological, let's say, dimension of coloniality, which sort of branches into not only epistemology as understood in the Western tradition theory of knowledge, but how these conceptions of knowledge translate or are interwoven with a whole axiology or normative order that gets imposed in practice. This is the emphasis, for example, given by Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh, who collaborate often. But Mignolo, as you know, talks about the ideal of decolonizing epistemology as actually the core, let's say, desideratum of decolonial practice. But the whole point of this group was to think of modernity and coloniality as inextricable. This is actually not, so this is a radicalization of the liberationist program, because as you know, as I've already mentioned, the liberationist program already began a kind of revisionary examination of the concept of European modernity and the critique of Eurocentric modernity. What people in the decolonial, let's say, decoloniality or modernity coloniality movement will say is that, in fact, there is an inextricability between coloniality and modernity. The result of this is that maybe it becomes, and this is the thesis, that it's not only about trying to find an alternative modernity, call it transmodernity, call it what you will, right? That there's something inherently colonial about the modern project. That maybe, in fact, therefore, what needs to be relinquished altogether is the aspiration to modernity. That modernity itself is pathologically colonial. Now, this, of course, has generated an extraordinary amount of controversy, right? Now, I should also mention that adjacent to this tradition, and this again, this is a coda. This is not part of what of the constellations that I will be examining, but adjacent, but also continuous, there's a genealogical vector, which again, oftentimes is close to this decoloniality vector, decoloniality, let's say, orientation, but it takes things in its own way and it has its own theoretical orientations and components. And that is a tradition and orientation that was very strongly influenced by the work of Foucault, and also specifically the work of Ángel Rama, who is mostly known as a literary critic, but who also wrote a very influential book, The Lettered City, La Ciudad Letrada, which again follows a roughly, let's say, Foucauldian approach to the reconstruction of the project of urbanization in Latin America as the construction of a precisely lettered city, a city that would be, quote unquote, organized according to the principles dictated by, let's say, the letrados, who were notaries, lawyers, urban planners. It was a completely pre-designed city, ordered city. But in this tradition, you find people like Santiago Castro Gomez, who I've already mentioned and quoted before, the author of Critique of Latin American Reason. And more recently, I mean, not more recently, he's been working for a while, but Elias Palti from Argentina. Elias Palti just wrote a very good book, which has been translated by Oxford. I think it's Oxford or Princeton, I forget, but it's called Misplaced Ideas, which is a reference to Schwarz. But this book is very much a spiritual sequel to the Critique of Latin American Reason by Castro Gomez, and I highly recommend it. I'll quote it at some point. And there you can find actually in that book much of what this tradition has to offer, which is what? Again, across genealogical lines, you know how Foucault likes to work, right? Essentially tell us the story you've been told is a kind of baby story that's much more complicated. There's all these tentacles within. He does the same, Palti does, with regards to the history of, for example, the independence movements of Latin America. And also later concerning, for example, the presumed dominance of positivism during the late mid-19th century in Latin America, and Krausism. He says they weren't really that dominant. And Enlightenment ideals weren't really all over the place coming from Europe and the project of independence. It was much more tenuous than that. So it's a work of historical reconstruction and revisionism, but it also has philosophical import. You read the book, you'll see what I mean. So again, the other thing is that many people from the liberationist movement adhere. So there's again a porosity between liberationism and decoloniality. This is the central book, incidentally. For those of you who wonder where this whole talk of decoloniality and coloniality modernity comes from, this is the essential book. I have a PDF in case anybody wants it. I actually don't know if this is translated. I don't think so. At least, I mean, some of the essays have been. And the most important, this is an incredibly high quality collection in general. There's some clunkers here and there, but the essays by Castro Gomez, by Dussel, by Mignolo is actually really good, and by Quijano, especially the Quijano essay, are of absolute importance. We will be reading a shorter version of this, but he republished this then in a journal later with some corrections and some, let's say, polish. So this collection is very important. And finally, there's the neo-universalist tradition, which roughly gestates and begins to take shape from the year 2000 or so and continues until today. And here we find figures like Ernesto Laclau, Fernando Zalamea, Gabriel Catren, Bruno Dostiles, others. I mean, I consider myself, to the extent that I work in Latin America, as an adherent of this tradition. I would like to think of myself as eventually contributing to this tradition, right? Now, among the influences that come to shape this new sort of orientation of thought that I don't think anybody has had much interest in sort of trying to reconstruct is something that is common not only to Latin American philosophy, but something that you see, for example, in neo-materialist approaches, neo-rationalist approaches, many of which are highlighted or put under the spotlight in the New Center. The appropriation of, for example, formal scientific and mathematical methods, advances in the natural and social sciences. Gabriel Catren, some of you might know, is a physicist, has 2 PhDs, one in quantum mechanics and the other in philosophy. An appropriation of Deleuze-Guattarian transcendental Spinozism. This is also something that you find in Catren, but also in people like Vivero de Castro, who does some nifty stuff. Lacanian psychoanalysis, as in the case, of course, of Laclau. Peircean pragmatism, as in the case of Zalamea. Neo-rationalism, as also in the case of Catren and Zalamea and Laclau. Dialectical materialism, vitalism, decolonial anthropology. And the idea here is that there is a possibility of reconciling the project of modernity and the universalist aspirations of modernity, and also, of course, the universalist, systematic, and absolutist scope of philosophy with the lessons of the decolonial and liberationist critiques of modernity and of Eurocentrism. So essentially, you can think of this kind of in analogy, if you think about Western philosophy, right? You have the Heideggerian critique of metaphysics, right? Which, and then it's deconstructionist sequels and it's historicist sequels, which basically tell us that the modern philosophical project has kind of collapsed, if not the very Western philosophical project inaugurated since the Greeks. And then you have more recently, in the last 20, 30 years or so, an attempt to rebuild the foundations of philosophy, but not simply ignoring or hiding under the rug, right, the critiques that were waged against traditional metaphysics, epistemology, Western philosophy and thought, but traversing it. What are the conditions to think of a post-critical, post-decolonial philosophy of Latin Americanist thought? That will be this project. And this is where we find Zalamea, Catrin do these kinds of works of formal ontology, drawing from all these formal resources to think of Latin America, or drawing from Latin America to think about a universalist philosophy. So it's a kind of, again, dialectical synthesis, or sort of traversal, if you will. I don't like using that term, dialectical synthesis, but it's a traversal of the presumed division or inextricability between coloniality and modernity that was proposed in the decolonial turn. And what we will see is that, specifically in the case of Catrin, the concept of what he calls an absolute modernity. There's a new concept of modernity which he calls absolute modernity, which is nevertheless responsive to what we hear from the decolonial critics of modernity. Castro Gomez is an ambiguous figure. He also is one of these people that you could say has now crossed from the quote-unquote decolonial moment in his thought to a post-decolonial moment where he has attempted to reconstitute the positive valences of not only philosophy in his case, but a political thought, a positive political thought. And he's begun negotiating with thinkers such as Zizek and Laclau, and his most recent writings are much more affirmative than just critical in the genealogical Foucauldian mode that I mentioned before. So not only an attempt to respond to the genealogical critiques of the decolonial turn and the epistemological racial considerations, but also the genealogical Foucauldian trajectory that I mentioned was somewhat adjacent or ran in parallel to the decolonial movement. So overall, what all these traditions share in common, these 5 traditions, how are we doing time? 12. Okay, great. Oh, wow. Okay, so all of these traditions, what we will see is they challenge what they call the mimetic impulse, right? Already you see this in the beginning of the Assumptive Project in the generation of 1900. We must not just have an imitative relation to Europe, to the United States, but one of creative appropriation. We need to take what we can, what is useful for us, model it in our own way. We shouldn't just simply abscond what's outside. That would be silly, and it's impossible. And we should actually forge on the basis of this creative appropriation the conditions for precisely a kind of democratic, multicultural, open society. Now, this task of creative appropriation will lead, as I mentioned already, not only to a series of reconceptualizations concerning what it is that Latin America is ultimately, let's say, what's its place in the geopolitical spectrum, what is the true way to read its history and experience, who are we Latin Americans, in a descriptive mode, but it's also a projective side. And this means, I think, quite importantly, that there is a complementarity between the tasks of, again, you can think of as a kind of dialectical sort of complementarity between realism and utopianism. Realism understood as the task of describing and explaining through the appropriation of different theoretical means Latin American history and social reality. On the one hand, the idea is thinkers before us and those around us have mischaracterized history, and actually we need new philosophical tools, conceptual tools, to adequately describe this reality and historical experience. That's the task of realism. But simultaneously, this task, this realist endeavor, is propedeutic and instrumental towards a utopian one, which is the attempt to imagine an ideal future in society that must be built. In other words, the discovery of the Latin American identity essence, the realist task, or the authentic representation of its reality, is the preparatory condition for the appropriation of this past, an authentic appropriation that would therefore enable it to realize its latent potentials and indeed even historical mission. We'll see that very specifically, there are some not only oracular, but very prophetic and almost scary, declarations by members of the first generation of the Assumptive Project, specifically by Vasconcelos, Reyes, and even Rodó, concerning this historical mission of Latin America in the global horizon. Now, here is where we get a thesis that I find very interesting from Sea. This we'll explore more when we get to him next week. But he makes this claim, again, borrowing from Caso and this term bovarismo, which is about the way that Latin America feels at odds with itself, right? Latin America has always felt this conflicted relationship to its own past. It has sort of felt that it was never truly European, that the colonial sort of experience was a sort of transposition of a foreign reality into a new territory, but it was really a sort of second-rate imitation of a culture that was happening abroad and that was being sort of imported. It never felt at ease with itself in its quote-unquote heritage from its Iberian past and its Iberian heritage, but at the same time, it couldn't identify with the Indo-American past before the arrival of the Europeans. The mestizo, the cultural hero of this first story, is a kind of homeless creature. It's a creature affected by what Novalis called homelessness, right? The sense of alienation from itself, the sense that it doesn't have an identity. It sees Europe as a kind of both place where the imposition of the colonial came, but also Western Europe and modern Europe as a kind of ideal model to follow. But it's, again, a foreign world, something very, very distant to itself. And the result of this, Sea says, is that Latin America had, until the Assumptive Project, had a relationship of disavowal to its past. It rejected its past. It did not want to accept its Iberian heritage. It wanted to erase it. It wanted a fresh start. It wanted to sort of clean the slate and simply sort of begin from zero. And this is what says, this is why says Latin American history has been defined by a kind of dialectical failure. Whereas Europe sort of grappled with its own contradictions and sort of appropriated always its own history and, mindfully, Latin America just simply kept juxtaposing different projects one into the other by borrowing things from outside without coping with its own history and its own experience. So the history of Latin America is the history of a series of juxtapositions until finally, in the Assumptive Project in the 20th century, there begins this kind of more patient reconsideration with regards to the past, where an appropriative relation, and therefore kind of self-consciousness in the Hegelian sense concerning the past, is finally progressively achieved. But this is very interesting because what it means is that what Sea does is a kind of meta-dialectical narrative, right, that describes the history of Latin America as being, strictly speaking, pre-dialectical or non-dialectical until it arrives at the moment of self-consciousness with the Assumptive Project, and then it progressively sort of realizes or brings the moment of self-consciousness into fruition. But, of course, this is all enveloped within a, again, precisely a meta-dialectical narrative, right? And again, what Sea will say is that what thinkers will have to do in order to appropriate this past authentically, which is what the Assumptive Project does, is to actually recognize that what defines Latin America is this homelessness itself. That there is no such, let's say, wholesome identities to be found anywhere or one thing, that it is defined by the experience of colonialism, by amputation, by being fractured from within, that the mestizo, understood properly, ontologically, if you will, right, is an incomplete hybrid being. And that this being, this mestizo identity, once appropriated, becomes then the condition for the creation of this universal culture that Latin America can become. The mestizo is not only, therefore, just the offspring of the European and the Indo-American populations or ethnic groups. It is a project or a canvas for what is possible. In other words, an unrestricted ethnic cultural synthesis, right? And that's what these people will think. Here is a quote by Sea again, Filosofía de la Historia Americana. For Latin Americans, a reality their own, seen as something strange, borrowed, or worse, imposed, and from which they can't sorry, let me move this a little bit to the right. And from which they can only free themselves by denying it as reality. A refusal that would have to be accompanied by the adoption of ideas that could give rise to another reality, the one taken as a model and constructed by other men. Men, for the same reason, considered superior by the Latin Americans, themselves committed to such an effort. We do not identify with the Iberian colonial past. We want to reject it. This was the civilizing project, the project of liberty, right? But in order to do this, to reject this past, and in order to find ourselves, we must look outside to modern Europe, to those countries, to France, to the United States, you name it, right? So there's this sort of, again, ironic sort of thing, which is we need to find ourselves, but in order to find ourselves, we need to find ourselves through the other. And this is what's going to, I'm going to stop here for 1 second, but this is going to yield a process that I am thinking in terms of what I call the three ironies. There are three ironies that are characteristic of this story that I've been like sort of just giving you the elevator pitch of. The three ironies are going to be three ways, essentially, in which Latin America, in its desperate attempt to find the conditions for mental and cultural independence, nevertheless keeps reiterating a form of dependency in and in relation to the foreign, Europe, the United States, other philosophies, and so on and so forth. And we'll see why there's three, let's say, levels or tiers of this. Yeah. Any thoughts? Any ideas? Been talking for a while, so it would be good to hear from somebody.
Yeah.
What happens? Oh, yeah.
Hi. I don't know if I've got really a question as such, but just it seems really kind of fascinating, this kind of pivotal point at which, there's a sort of rearticulation of this moment of break or severing or fractured self, almost, I'm thinking, kind of in psychoanalytic terms, where it's then becomes the conditions of possibility, so like, as you're saying, in a Hegelian sense, that it's, that the other is in the self, and it's a finding through the other that you kind of, it's recursivity is really what I'm trying to say here, actually, I think. So different models of recursivity in psychoanalysis and in Hegelian sort of dialectics seems to be what a lot of these kind of movements are positioning themselves in different relations to that. Although I'm not necessarily saying that those theories are running all the way through, but perhaps in later there's a kind of retroactive, sort of consolidation of it, retelling of the story, I guess, in some ways. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely does. And actually, there are very, very explicit proclamations to this point that progress. So this idea that the Latin American subject is somehow defined by precisely this let's say fracture or incompleteness, right? This ontological void that sort of splits it from within, not only because it's split between two ethnic heritages or so, but because it precisely feels neither. It's not just simply that, I have two essences within myself, right? No, it's that I am neither. There's nothing, I don't fit with this or the other. And this gap being the condition or being the true, what needs to be, in other words, this gap is what needs to be positivized. It should no longer be, because thinking of it as a sort of purely negative, lack, right? As something privative, in search for something wholesome, right? The phallic other, right? Like, that's precisely what cannot be accomplished, right? The Latin American subject needs to sort of find itself as this gap, right? As incomplete. Now, what's ironic, you can almost foretell the irony, right? That this is actually something that European thinkers had also thought for themselves, right? We are not complete and wholesome. We are the divided people. Our subjectivity is not defined in this essentialist mode by a kind of, pure self-identity. But so there's a kind of even in this level, right? There's a kind of, let's say, thematic or argumentative affinity between the European register and what the Latin American register is going to say. And I think that this is going to become more clear as we move and see some examples of this.
Yeah, I mean, but in those theoretical models, it is universal. It is a human condition. It's humanized, isn't it? In
Exactly.
psychoanalysis. So it's yeah. I'm just also wondering about you speak about kind of cultural practices as well. I'm wondering about technology. And even the space of technology. Is there anything in the picture here about that? In terms of, I'm just thinking about that such potential, that positive sort of space of the kind of fracture, and this kind of becoming. If there's a kind of where technology could kind of think of as this like kind of exteriorization of thought, like when you speak about the projection, into the utopia, and also the freeing of the organs. That's a kind of what techne does. Techne and inscription. So I'm just kind of wondering about that sort of side of the story. I mean, that's just bringing in something completely different, but
very, very much so. In fact, one of the things. So if you look at, for example, in the first decades by roughly the 1920s, when the first wave of the so-called telluric novel or the novel of the land, the social realist novel begins to take off, where you see a lot of the, let's say, reflections of these projects of alternative modernity in a literary register. I'm thinking of something, for example, you think of Rómulo Gallegos, who is one of the great thinkers novelists of Venezuela, Doña Bárbara. You see, for example, the image of the railroad, right? As a kind of, not just as a symbol of urban development, right? But as a kind of telos of the kind of transition that Latin America was undergoing from the llano y la pampa and this kind of rural setting, the promise of modernity. It was always projected through these figures that were, let's say, figures not only of technology in the abstract, but very concretely figures of commerce and transition, historical transition, right? That would, so, in this novel, for example, right, you have a very clear juxtaposition between the man and the horse dominating the realm of the Pampa and the villainous woman witch, Doña Bárbara, who is in control of the llano with this kind of occultist power, in tandem with this, irresistible momentum of modernity that's arriving. And it's symbolized through these new means of technological development, right? So like that, and you can find, I mean, I could just keep citing examples in how this becomes like expressed. In Mexican muralismo in the 1910s, Rivera, of course, one of the things that he wants to do is when he thinks about retroactively the history of Mexico, and you see this in every sort of representation, there's a very clear concern with the place that techniques plays in history. And in one of his most famous paintings, murals, El Hombre en la Encrucijada, you see mankind in the middle as the kind of as having in his hands the sort of machine of history, in which at the crossroads you see all of the ontological orders from the super personal to the to the historical and cosmic, all intertwined by technique, by human thought and the human hand. So technique becomes the ally, or the let's say inextricable from modernity, from the vector towards modernity, and from therefore the way that humans sort of conceive of a destiny for themselves, right? This is very present in the utopian imaginaries that become forged in this trajectory. There's a question in the chat or a comment. Let me read it. Raviv said, I was struck by the Zalamea quote you mentioned early on, where he says that the universalist aspect of Latin American culture is a result of being on a cultural borderline or taking a position on a spectrum. It's making me wonder, in general, how are these spectra or other topological arrangements generated by cultural practice or historical injunction? And how is it that they lead to a more abstractive or universalist cultural practice, or the sorry, I have a little bit of hiccup, or the uptake of reason or self-awareness? Sorry for the word salad. No, not at all. So the way that so all these terms are actually terms that he's borrowing from Pierce, okay? So in the book, what you have is actually a structure where first chapter, he just gives you this genealogy in a kind of elevator pitch manner, which is just name, name, and a little summary of why he's including them. And then in the second chapter, he basically fleshes out this whole Peircean ontology and pragmatics, where he defines all these terms, in Spanish, contrapunteo, síntesis, el continuo, the continuum, and blah, blah, blah. We'll see this when we read, because we'll be reading 2 chapters, which are relatively short, but easily read. But so all of those concepts have a kind of definitional basis in the book. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to rehearse the definitions right now because we haven't read it yet. But you'll see it when you read it. They sound metaphorical at first, and yes, there's a question about I think of Zalamea as like the Badiou of the of Latin America. I really do, because I think what he does is he has a mathematical formal ontology that he then uses to think about all these historical processes in art, science, politics, love, right? In his case, philosophy and literature. But yeah, we'll see that. Any other thoughts? Or I think it's a good time to take a break also. Usually because I need to take a bathroom break for sure. What time is it? 12:57, and we have until what, 1:30? 1:30, right?
Yes, exactly.
So, okay, so let's do just only 5 minutes, okay, as a break, because I do have a lot to move. We have a lot. So, all right, 5 minutes. All right, I'm back. Please check in when you guys are so we can resume ASAP. I think we can resume, Paula.
Yes, we can.
Great. So, did you pause the recording or should I just?
No, it's going.
It's
We
going, okay. Okay, usually, okay, never mind. Okay, great. So now we left off, I mentioned the quote from Sea, which again sort of repeats this point about bolarismo, which he borrows from Caso. And what I wanted to describe now is what I call the three ironies. This is all incidentally, this is all part of work in progress. So I'm like sort of putting some ideas out that are, I think, helpful to navigate this terrain. So this is first attempt to explain something that I hope to develop more closely once this book is finished. Let me share. So the first, there's these three ironies that I call, of course. So we've already kind of seen this first irony in several ways, right? Which is that in order for Latin America to liberate itself from the colonial past and achieve cultural or mental emancipation, Latin America must first find in Europe or in the United States or somewhere else, right, ideas, models, and philosophical frameworks to both interpret its own history and to imagine a future for itself. In other words, it must continue to rely on somebody else in order to find itself, in order to describe itself, in order to think about what it should be. Right? And this is part of what Caso already names bolarismo, right? The idea that Latin America feels both at odds with itself and in need for an identity, but it also looks toward Europe, modern Europe, and the United States in the civilizing project as a kind of model from which it should sort of find an identity. But in the sequence of the assumptive project, what happens is that there is this again, and Sea, I think, expresses this anxiety very clearly, which is there's a sense of an inauthentic relation to the past. Latin Americans have been plagued, and the reason for their failures, the failures of their republics, has to do with an inauthentic relation to their own past. Therefore, if only they could find the right conceptual tools to think about their past authentically and appropriate it, right? Then Latin America would be freed, therefore, of this juxtapositional mode of thinking. It would finally migrate into dialectical thought. It would finally be able to understand and accept itself, and therefore also find a future for itself, right? Now, this is ironic because, as you can tell, there's a kind of reproduction of this kind of Heideggerian narrative, right? Which is that the reason, as you know, Heidegger says famously that the reason for the derelictions of modernity, right? The reasons why modernity in Europe has fallen apart is because we have sort of incurred in this kind of ontological amnesia in relation to the past. And that only through the patient labor genealogical of a kind of deconstruction of our own metaphysical history, we will be able to both appropriate this history authentically and cross over to a second beginning. This same sort of basic model or reading of history, that the explanation for the failures of our present and incapacity to forge a future is due to an inauthentic relation to the past, is what I called the first irony, the irony of mimesis, because it is, at the end of the day, a kind of, always relying on something other, again, the European, the United States, that is going to give you the key for this relationship. So with this, we have the second irony, which I call the irony of space. And this irony basically describes how in Latin American universalism, there's a kind of inversion of the traditional Eurocentric narrative and model of universality. And this is the long story short what it means. So the search for the Latin American local essence in relation to the European global horizon becomes inverted or subject to a transvaluation. Once Europe and Eurocentrism is revealed as a failed universality overdetermined by its own Eurocentric biases, and Latin American's own essence becomes identified with the cradle of a true or authentic universality conceived as human freedom and humanist culture, purified from the inferiority complex that reiterates its peripheral position of colonial dependency. In other words, the first position is Latin America, here we are, a locality peripheral in relation to the European other, which is the model, right? Oh, Europe, the harbinger of all things modern, the place of the universal. But the Latin American Assumptive Project inverts this and says, no, Europe was the site of a failed universality. They failed at universality because they were too Eurocentric. What compromised it was precisely the fact that they were particularist. They were too biased, right? We will see this very clearly when we look at Dussel, for example. And it is us, Latin America, on the contrary, it's our locality, it's our distinctive essence to be universal. There is therefore a kind of short circuit, or again, dialectical resolution between the local or the particular and the universal, right? It is precisely because Latin America lacks a definite essence of itself that it is uniquely attuned for universality or prepared for universality. So therefore, Latin America becomes now the place for the promise of a realized universality in the sense of the transcultural, culture, a humanist culture where human freedom flourishes. And Europe is now the particularist excrescence, the failed universal, overdetermined by its own nationalist Eurocentric biases, right? Now, this is very interesting because as it moves forward, as we move forward, and here we get to the third irony, which is the most interesting one, I think, what we will see is that something quite familiar begins to take place. In this search for the kind of cleansing of Latin America from its residual Eurocentric residues, right? So, once we are free from this, we will accept our own universality. It will turn out that every thinker in every generation will retroactively say, we didn't free ourselves from Eurocentrism quite enough. We were still too Eurocentric, therefore we have still failed. This is why we are still failing despite this. We understand that universality is our mission and it's us, but nevertheless, we have never been able to let go completely. We've continued to depend on Europe in a way. So what you have is that you have a retroactive diagnosis that those attempts earlier in the Assumptive Project to free themselves from this mimetic relationship to Europe and the United States in the search for a creative appropriation and synthesis failed, right? So, for example, Mariátegui is going to say that, thinkers from like Rollo incurred in a kind of naive, idealistic, liberal mode of thought, and that only through the adoption of historical materialism we would have a true realistic description of our history and emancipatory project. Then the liberationists will say, no, that traditional Marxism is still too Eurocentric, and the description of the world given through these lenses is still too marked by specific experiences that marked Europe, and so on and so forth. There's always a kind of retroactive pathologization of the attempts to be universal as still too contaminated by Eurocentrism. And the reason why this is ironic is because this movement, this sequence of retroactive pathologization recreates the dynamic of European philosophy itself in the 20th century. I've mentioned this already in a passing manner. As you know, after the Kantian critique after the Heideggerian critique of metaphysics in the 20th century, you have a sequence in which thinkers come along and say, we didn't cleanse ourselves from the kind of quote unquote metaphysical let's say, baggage far enough. This is already present in Kant, in the post-Kantian context, right? Kant still borrows too much metaphysics from the scholastics, and Aristotle, and the forms of space and time are Euclidean. Nietzsche then goes ahead and says, oh, the modern project is still overdetermined by all these things. Heidegger says, well, no, Nietzsche still has a metaphysics of the will. People after, well, Heidegger still is overdetermined by this conception of an authentic appropriation of the national essence of being, and so on and so forth. In other words, Latin America doesn't only repeat or appropriate ideas from Europe, but even in the process of critically assessing its own failures, it reproduces this kind of critical arc that marks European philosophy. So this is the third irony, the irony of time. The condition of dependency does not only find itself reiterated in how authors and traditions borrowed or used European models for their own production without sufficiently ridding itself of specific biases and assumptions unfit for Latin American social reality. This Eurocentric hang-up would be reflected in the very diachronic critical retrospective mode of self-assessment concerning this insufficient process of conceptual normative purging and distillation. And this is the schema for this sort of movement, right? You have presumably a movement that gets closer and closer to finally ridding ourselves from the Eurocentric residue. So this occurs throughout the sequence of projects, and within the assumptive project, the sequence of moments in the assumptive project, let's say, in which we would, in theory, be approximating the ideal limit, the moment in which we finally are free from Eurocentrism and can finally assume our role and destiny of being the universal culture that we are, right? But this moment of progressive purification, which moves forward, is complemented always with a process of retroactive pathologization, of saying that the previous moment in the theoretical sequence of projects, right, was too contaminated still, or was contaminated still by Eurocentric biases. So you have both an approximation, an asymptotic approximation towards universality, and a retroactive pathologization that detects the undetected Eurocentric residues in the former projects. These are the three ironies that I call. Now, with that said, that's the general, let's sort of mark or framework that I'm presenting now. And now I'm going to talk more specifically about the first configuration of thought, and we're going to take a look at Rollo. And to begin with, because the first constellation of thought takes its cue as a reaction, as I mentioned, to positivism, I'm going to say just a few words and spend a little time sort of like nurturing this historical background a little bit more. So as I mentioned, it was Crossism and positivism that were the dominant philosophies in the mid-late 19th century, and which were adopted by the so-called civilizing project. And these currents of thought, it should be said, would remain very influential during the formative phase of the assumptive project. It's not like positivism was simply just, went away. Now, what was really this appropriation of positivism, or what did the Latin American thinkers of these generations think by this? There was a series of just very fundamental principles. First of all, there was a kind of affirmation of scientific rationality over theology. So there was a very explicit overturning or reaction against the quote-unquote theological mode of philosophizing that had become scholastically sort of embedded in the schools. You always have to remember that in this context, in the first formative phase of the but really until the 60s and 70s, all of these debates are also very tightly woven to a question concerning university and school reform, educational reform. There was a whole question of what kind of schools and universities are we going to build, what kind of curricula, what kind of philosophy and studies are they going to have, because that's going to determine the kind of mental and cultural, let's say, ideas that people come out with, right? So the idea here was we need to actually build the university as a kind of technical, modern institute that imparts the ideas and methods of the sciences and scientific rationality over this old crusty old theological formation. And again, this was a response to the failures of what revolutionary romanticism and the kind of Enlightenment enthusiasm of the liberation period and independence movements had yielded, because there was this kind of great anarchic sort of unrest and civil unrest that did not yield a kind of unitary stability and republicanist stability that Bolivar, for example, had sought for. And this led to a series of conflicts of different kinds: conservatives versus liberals, federalists versus unitarists, for example, in Argentina, right? And so the members of the Civilizing Project aligned this rationalist program for a new pedagogical model of culture based on scientific principles of reason to a kind of new liberal republicanist model of social and economic development. And this was very much the program, for example, of Manuel de Rosas in Argentina, López de Santa Anna in Mexico. And unfortunately, what happened, as it's usually the case, is that this quote unquote philosophy that would be earlier supposed to be the antidote to the chaos of revolutionary romanticism would then become used to justify despotism and dictatorial regimes, as in the case of El Porfiriato, the regime of Porfirio Diaz in Mexico. Now, in order to understand, those of you who are more interested in understanding this kind of historical moment, I think still the canonical reference and book is the book by Leopoldo Sea, the one that actually made him famous and considered to be by many still his best book, which is El Positivismo en Mexico. There's an O missing there, obviously. It's a 1943 book, but then I should say that rather than reading that, if you're going to read something by the early Sea, let's say, you should read El Pensamiento Latinoamericano, which is actually an extension of this book. It's basically the same book, but it's just sort of fleshed out to include what happens after positivism into the Assumptive Project, even though he only spends a brief moment then discussing the fall of positivism, and especially he focuses on Martí in the last few chapters. It's short, but it's just more complete. So the major ideas that were borrowed from positivism was, first of all, it went also chronologically. At first, it was Comte that was the center thing, and Comte especially the three-stage theory, which was mapped by Barrera. We're going to see this actually in the next slide. The three-stage theory of Comte was actually used to model the history and the prospect of Latin American societies quite explicitly. Mill's psychologism was also appropriated, and his utilitarianism was also appropriated. Specifically, the psychologism was appropriated as a kind of a means to justify a kind of individualist version of the liberal project, right? An idea that, in essence, the logic of competition, the logic of, let's say, seeking for one's best interest, right? That foundation yielded strong, self-determinant, free individuals, and that one should foster this. And Spencerian evolutionism was also quite important in this constellation. In fact, there was a movement from Comte to Spencer as we move forward in this genealogy. And there was a slogan that was used not only first in Mexico, and then it sort of trickled around the continent, which was progress and order. Order because it was a response to the chaos, of the post-independence period, and progress in the, again, model of liberal capitalist modernization. Here is a quote by Carlos Beorlegui from Historia del Pensamiento Filosófico Latinoamericano, History of the Philosophical Latin American Thought, which is, by the way, a very important book, the most comprehensive book on the history of Latin American philosophy and thought published thus far. Beorlegui is from Spain, but he's done us all a great favor by publishing, as Enrique Doucet just said, like 2,000 pages of philosophy in like just one volume. It's really an archival resource that everybody who works on these topics should have. But anyway, from Comte's positivism to Mill's psychologism, and from Mill to Spencer's evolutionism, without taking into account the materialist elements of Littre's doctrine and Taine's middle doctrine, all certainly positivists, there are in them, it must be expected, important differences that are evident in the reception and development of the current in America. So this is just to indicate that, of course, positivism was a house with many mansions, and the different ideas were adopted at different times. Incidentally, this is the cover of the Beorlegui book. It's not translated. I don't think it will be either, but it's very hard to find also a physical copy, but I have a PDF also, and I can upload it or send it to you if you guys want. It's really interesting. And as I mentioned, when it comes to Comte, there was the three-stage theory was adapted to think of the three major phases that the members of the Civilizing Project thought or conceived as formative in the history of Latin America. And this was first proposed by Gabino Barrera in Mexico in 1867 in a famous text. Actually, it was a proclamation called Oración Cívica, civic prayer or oration or proclamation. So the three stages, as you know, in Comte are the theological stage, the metaphysical stage, and the scientific stage. Metaphysical you can interchange with philosophical. He uses both. The theological stage corresponded to the colonial period. The metaphysical stage corresponded to the period of independence. And finally, the Republican period would correspond to the scientific stage. So again, it was like, notice this was this kind of loose analogical application of a very sort of crass, coarse-grained historical model to just think about both our history and where we want to go. Certainly, the Republican period of Latin America, when this was written, right, was very far from being a quote-unquote scientific stage in which you would have this kind of technocratic, efficient governance, right, or stability. But that was the goal. Here are just some of the names that were associated with the movement in different regions of the continent, just so you can get an idea of who was involved with this. But if I wanted to summarize just this whole constellation, is that there was really at this point an unfortunate tendency towards social Darwinism of some sort, to try, in other words, to extract, not just in the Spencerian register, but as you can see even already with the Comtean register, the idea that there is a kind of natural progression in history, and that this natural progression in history, which devolves in this kind of modern, quote unquote, scientific, rational, let's say, stage of human development, translates also to a mode of governance, Now, as you know, Comte himself went a little too far with this, where he even begins to speak about what he named the religion of humanity at the end. He thinks that there's actually a kind of form of religiosity or religious organization that corresponds to the scientific stage. And this was actually the matter of much controversy among Latin American positivists, mostly centered in Chile, I should say. But that aside, the whole point is that there was this idea or this compulsion to try to find a kind of evolutionary register that would explain human progress in societies in accordance with scientific rationality. So trying to give a kind of quote unquote materialist / naturalist explanation of the evolution of human societies, and then to try to say that Latin American societies were surely enough in the path and needed to quote unquote push for this evolutionary sequence to take its course toward what? Toward its natural conclusion, the scientific stage, which is again a liberal, capitalist, modern, urban model, right? Modeled again on the United States and modern Europe. In this model, in this framework, the mestizo, el indio are evolutionary excrescences. And Sarmiento perhaps writes the most violently about this. There are passages of Sarmiento that if you read them, and many of you might have, are quite repulsive, right? About how the filthy Indians should be eliminated, and the mestizo, well, the gauchos, right, are in the Pampas are just unruly deviants that need to be eliminated. The cowboy, right? But in any case, social, let's say, Darwinism and a kind of sense of a necessity for ordering society alongside technocratic, capitalist, liberal, modern development. Now, positivism enters into a crisis, largely because it was, of course, as I mentioned, reserved only for bourgeois elites. It didn't yield the kind of democratization process and stability that it was expected of it. And new philosophical tendencies towards the end of the 19th century begin to be taken in. There's a neo-Kantian tendency in the work of Windelband that gets brought in. Bergsonist vitalism comes very strongly in, as we're going to see. Crotch's idealism, Delphi. And all of these, what all of these do jointly is that they complicate this quote-unquote reductionist scientific conception of instrumental rationality and the liberal capitalist model of development. So there's a new tendency to try to complicate this, but at the same time, and this is important, all these trends would not just simply involve a kind of regression to the kind of vain romanticism of the post-revolutionary period and the revolutionary period, the chaotic. Rather, what this would allow them to do, these new philosophical trends, these new philosophical currents, is to defy positivism while at the same time appropriating from positivism that which was productive. And this is what we are going to actually see in this first generation of the 1900s, which I think condenses the first time that this universal, let's say, scope of Latin America as a project becomes voiced. And I think Martí gives it like the most clear and, again, canonical expression. Here's another quote by Borlegui, and then I'm going to give you a quote by Martí himself. Aware that the Pan-American doctrine was, and this is in reference to the Monroe Doctrine of the United States, the Pan-American doctrine was nothing more than a project of North American domination and hegemony. The need to recover the Spanish-American unity fostered in his time by Bolivar emerges in Latin America in the early 20th century, right? At the tail end of the 19th. Although with a new way of understanding, this is what has been called the second project of Hispano-Americanism, consisting above all in turning our gaze back to Spain and to the identity features that came from the Spanish language and Hispanic culture, and in closing ranks in the face of the feared expansionism of the giant of the North. The fundamental features that in general terms characterize and bring together this generation are the following: one, anti-positivism; two, anti-imperialism; three, anti-colonialism of all kinds, including the neocolonialism of the United States, of course; four, rethinking the question of Latin American identity from a new concept of Hispanidad; five, emergence of an appreciation of mestizo culture with the participation of the Indian and the Black in the configuration of the new Latin American identity. This last element is not always present. The other, I think, four are. But you find five, for example, all of these five in the work of Martí. And this is the quote from Martí that I think, again, condenses in an oracular manner the aspiration. Without the full and free development of the particular diverse, it will never be possible to achieve a universality worthy of the name. In other words, what Martí is saying here is that without paying attention and without fostering the inherent diversity that Latin America finds within itself, in its, let's say, crisol, as we say, I don't know what's the actual translation of crisol, but in its kind of panoply of ethnic, let's say, multitudes, in its cultural diversity, in the experience of mestizaje, in the Indo-American past, and in the Iberian heritage. If it cannot find and celebrate and figure out that this diversity constitutes its strength, it will fail to achieve a universality to which it is worth, to which it can aspire, right? So notice again, there's a kind of resolution between the local and the universal. It's actually attending to the multiplicity of diverse local forms that define Latin America as a space of synthesis that enables it to define itself as ripe for universality. And here's a quote by Rodó, which explains, I think, rather well the turning the back on positivism, but not without qualifications. And here's where he's going to tell us that it's actually not simply a regression to the idealist visions of the independentist past. Positivism, which is the cornerstone of our intellectual formation, is no longer the dome that finishes and crowns it. In the sphere of life and in the criterion of its activities, we tend to restore to ideas, to resort, it should be here, as the norm and object of human purposes. Many of the privileges of sovereignty that the overflowing impulse of utility took away from them. Only our idealism does not resemble the idealism of our grandfathers. The spiritualists and romantics of 1830, he's thinking of Alberti, Sarmiento, Echeverria, the revolutionaries and utopians of 48, the next generation. Between the two characteristics of ideality, the positivism of our parents stands in the way. Now, as I mentioned, the War of 1898, the Cuban War of Independence, was the event that triggered this kind of revulsion against the Nordomania, which broke the spell not only of positivism, but of looking at the US as a model. And it also was the moment, of course, in which we saw finally the rupture of the last territorial holdings and colonial holdings of the Spanish Iberian Empire. And as the US emerged as the new face of imperialism and colonialism in the continent, and as the Monroe Doctrine appeared, as we've already seen, as a kind of Pan-Americanist doctrine that was really underhandedly just a process for annexation and territorial expansion and the hegemonization of the United States as the new quote-unquote leader of the epicenter of the Americas, there is this kind of reaction and this coalition of Latin America and a kind of even retreat and necessity to reappropriate Hispanidad, the Hispanic heritage, against the United States, against the northern neighbor. So Rodó, now we can talk about him and look at a few of the passages. Let me just turn, oh shit, we're out of time. I'm so sorry. Look at, just like, I have a lot. That's all that I have in fun. But that's what happens. Right, Alan?
Yeah, we can take 15 minutes more, so we have like 10 more minutes, but as you prefer, if you prefer that we
Well,
take from...
I want to actually get to talk to the people here to know who they are, and so we said that we could do this now.
Yeah, we can do that. Sure.
Okay, so thank you.
No.
So let me know when I can ask people to speak.
Yeah, you can do it now, as you prefer.
Okay, great. So I'm just gonna go through the group in order and ask you guys again, simply just say who you are, what your background, if any, in Latin American studies or Latin American philosophy might be, your interest in the class, so that I know what things to focus on. I know I should have done this at the beginning, but I couldn't. Alan Diaz first. Hola, Alan, ¿cómo estás?
Hi everyone. Hi Daniel. Nice to see you again.
Gusto verte.
Yes, so I'm Alan. I'm from Mexico. I'm doing a PhD in Germany currently. And yeah, my background is in architecture, but also in theory, some critical theory mostly. And yeah, I'm embarrassingly ignorant about the whole landscape of Latin American thought. Like all these names that I know Dani has been mentioning, like growing up in Mexico, like many of those names kind of are there, or like also, I don't know, in the philosophy faculty, all the there's like a presence of these names, but also not like perhaps like a lot of teaching of these thinkers.
By the way,
So
Alan Alan is from Mexico, because you didn't say it.
I did say it.
Oh, you did say that.
I-
I'm deaf and dumb.
Yeah,
Please
but
keep going.
so yeah, I'm also kind of really excited to kind of learn a bit more about this, but also yeah, mostly interested like in like this yeah, kind of like this transition from this tradition of like liberationism towards like decolonialism, and how yeah, kind of like the traps of like decolonial thinking that you already mentioned, because like yeah, in Latin America it's kind of like the dogma somehow, like all this tradition of like universalism is kind of really unfashionable. So yeah, I'm really interested to see where it goes.
Excellent. Thank you. Niam, is that how you pronounce it? Please correct me. Anybody I mispronounce your names, just let me know.
It's Niamh.
Niamh.
Niamh. Niamh. The MH is a V. It's a
Oh, Niamh.
Yeah.
Niamh. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I'm Niamh. I'm from Ireland, based in Ireland. I have a fine art background. But I also did a PhD in philosophy on Deleuze's diagram, a reading of Leibniz's Art of Combinations in Deleuze's diagram. I'm very interested to hear more about how Peirce's diagram comes into this, because I haven't really done much work on that at all. So what's most relevant for me to say about that really is that I'm an artist and curator as well. So I do research on archives, and I'm looking at the kind of diagram as an approach to researching archives and to inviting artists to respond, making work in response to the archives of particular historical events. So it's reconstructing those archives with a kind of, view to opening up other possible histories, so the project I'm working on right now, and which is why I've joined this course in particular, because I think it's really going to help me, and I hope I can contribute to it too, I'm working on an archive which is about a hedge school history in Ireland in the 1800s. So the hedge school was literally a pop-up marginal school in the hedgerows for the Gaelic Irish community who were prohibited from mainstream schooling. And the particular archive is a hedge school master archive. So it's actually, a really beautifully scripted series of manuscripts teaching everything from like astronomy to geometry, the classics, as well as how to keep accounts and write love letters. But interestingly, it was actually it was written in English, and he taught in English as he was an Anglo-Irish. And that was really a tangent to this kind of retroactive history about the hedge school that was very much became part of nationalist movement, because it was through the Irish language. So when we had in the early 20th century, a bit later, a kind of Celtic revival movement, the Irish language and revitalization was at the center of that. So my archive is actually a little bit of a tangent to that because it was in English, but that introduces the really interesting element, of the universalism. So there's a kind of a humanist universalism coming in there, that because there was a Catholic emancipation history happening in Ireland and movements that were, following movements in Europe, that saw English as the universal language of suffrage. So already you have this kind of, subjugation, of the peasant agrarian, worker and their Irish language identified with that. So I'm just actually looking at this archive and a number of other sort of archives in a kind of an ecosystem of colonial resistance, really. And I'm kind of using sort of diagrams to also kind of work with those. Yeah. So that's
awesome.
There's really interesting kind of questions, obviously, about the local, and study of the local kind of archive of history, and the question of the universal. Yeah.
Thank you. No, that's amazing. Pleasure. Raviv?
He wrote it because I think he can talk.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry.
So I don't know. Should we read it out loud?
I'll read it, yes. Typing on my brief introduction. I'm Raviv, based in New York City, background in mathematics, and I've been studying philosophy at the New Center much as I've been able to over the past few years. No real background in Latin American studies, but as a person of mixed cultural and ethnic backgrounds, I've always found inspiration in learning more about the colonial history from all over the world and development of Latin American culture and politics, in particular insofar as it addresses at a mass scale the problems I sometimes encounter as an individual. Thank you very much. Thank you, Raviv. Georgia says, hey, I'm Georgia. I'm auditing this class, but I've enjoyed today so much, I'm going to switch. Is that allowed? Don't know.
Yes, I think write to me, Georgia, or I'll write to you. I'll write here my email.
Great. Then we have Andrek.
Yes, Andre, yes. I'm a certificate student here at the New Center. Sorry.
It's a little, can you speak a little louder? Because I think at least for me, the sounds. Yeah, now it's a little better. Yeah.
was this weird Bluetooth headphones. I'm a certificate student here at the New Center, joined recently, and I have a background in experimental music. I studied architecture, and I'm about to get my degree in a few weeks, I hope. Particularly for this seminar, I don't have that background in philosophy. I have a brief overview of European philosophy, and I mean, I'm reading a lot, but I don't have a versatile reading and writing background or anything like this. But for this seminar, I think my initial interest came from. I mean, I had the chance to do a study trip this summer in Mexico with my school, and I stayed for longer. I stayed for almost 1 month, and I think I was very. I mean, of course, there's always this saying: "There's many Mexicos," and it's very complex. But for me, it was very interesting to see it, how much America is now having an influence. I mean, it always had, but I mean, like just very recent changes, and I think it's a bit of like now a way of learning that which the kind of knowledge that I wish I had before I went on this trip. So I'm really thankful for all the philosophers that I never knew, and that are maybe not translated yet into English, but it's quite interesting. And yeah, I don't speak Spanish or anything.
Shame on you. No.
Yeah,
So-
no, but I think it's very interesting to look at, especially right now at this part of the world. Again, in a sense that I mean, as you spoke about, as a potential for synthesis, for change, for taking a bit but not too much. And I think this whole cosmic, I mean, now I'm simplifying things, but the universalist and cosmic kind of ideas that are mingling in these areas are just have a lot of potential, I think, and need to be much more studied.
Wonderful.
And also, as an architect, I'm just interested in as soon as something gets productive, and I think this kind of thought is very not so well known and gets very productive. And
Thank
I'm
you
also
so much.
quite tired. Yeah, it's a bit late here.
Oh yeah, and it was Halloween yesterday. I couldn't sleep because there was so much noise. Emma, you're saying before you leave, do you want to introduce yourself, or did you leave already? I think she left already, right? Oh, okay. Carlos Gijon, you're next on the list.
Hi, I'm Carlos Quijón Jr. I'm based between Manila and New York. Institutionally, I'm with MoMA. I'm a research fellow for Southeast and East Asia. Independently, I'm an art historian and curator whose research interests are on ideas of regionality and transregionality, and how to think comparatively and horizontally about these art histories. So I recently curated an exhibition on Southeast Asia and African affinities between Southeast Asia and Africa in the 1960s. And now I'm starting to develop an exhibition and symposium project on Southeast Asia and South America, Latin America. I've read some of the philosophers, especially Dussel and Mignolo, some Mariátegui, but it was nice hearing a more comprehensive intellectual history of Latin America. So I'm here to have that knowledge as well, alongside a more contemporary knowledge of the region. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And I think we have only Walter Bolito. I don't know if Walter, are you there? Hi. Well,
Can you
oh,
hear me?
yeah,
Oh,
Walter.
hi.
Yeah, hi, how are you?
My name is Walter. I am a PhD student in computer science here in Brazil. And my research focus in the interaction of education and the teaching of computation in basic education, high school and basic school. My area of work is heavily influenced by the technical approach from Skinner, behaviorism, and so on, and from the side, and another side there is constructivism from Simon Papert, related to Dewey and Piaget. I
Awesome.
was interested in this discipline because here in Latin America, we got a lot of thinkers related to philosophy and educational experience. In education, we got Paulo Freire and Saviani, and it's like Paulo Freire proposed I don't know in English, liberation, educational liberation. I forgot the word in English. And Saviani, on the other side, here in Brazil, proposed a Marxism pedagogy based in historic teachings of uncontextualization, kind of related to STS studies. And we got two strong influences who are conflicted between the two. And we in Brazilian university, we got this applied thinkers like we learn Paulo Freire, we learn Saviani, but we don't have, I think in history, in the history course of university, we don't have the education in Latin American story, and we don't learn how Mariátegui or José Martí from Cuba has an influence in Paulo Freire thinking, and how these thinkers read other experiences of preliminary thinkers here in Latin America. I forgot there is a woman, I forgot her name, that is one of the first thinkers of anarchism. I think she's Peruvian. One thinkers of anarchism
Mato de
in
Turner?
Latin America.
Oh,
I
Mikey.
forgot. Isabella
Oh,
Walter, allow me to go
okay.
to Isabella because
Okay.
we're already 20 minutes past, so I just want to.
Okay.
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 Sorry, my mic was on.
Isabella, sorry. Maybe, yeah, because we're past from the time, maybe next session we can start with Isabella, Georgia, with the presentations that we're missing. Is it okay?
Okay. Let me see. Okay, great.
Okay. I also paste the link for the presentations. I'm going to ask you then which are the chapters of Ariel, because I just placed excerpt 1 and excerpt 2. And if you want, you can start putting your names for the presentations.
Okay,
But anyway, I'll write an email with everything.
great.
Excuse me, are we going to be presenting live or are we uploading them?
As you prefer.
As you prefer.
Daniel also prefer.
Yeah, I mean, I because we're very short on time, I want to give more time for discussion also. So I encourage record it. But if you want to present live, just note when you write in the Excel sheet what your preferred is, so that way I can organize in advance.
Yeah, and if we are then going to be presenting on the same, do we need to coordinate with each other what we are presenting on, or do we just choose and then upload?
I would hope that if somebody is writing on or presenting on a topic, that someone else would do something different. But if you want to take it in your own direction and do the same thing, you can.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you all. Thank you, Daniel, for the great session, and see you next week.
Thank you.
very much, Daniel. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.